This is the fifth and final episode in our series on Henry VIII and the Tudors. We left off in episode 4 with the death of Henry VIII and the survival of his last wife, Catherine Parr. And Henry has left England in a perilous situation. It is no longer a Catholic country, but the Church of England is not as entirely Protestant as many of the Reformation churches springing up across Europe, and especially Germany, either. It's something of a hybrid. It's somewhere in between. And the stage is set for the pendulum to begin to swing wildly from one direction to the other as the country struggles to find its footing with the legacy that Henry VIII has left. Now, if you've been following this podcast for a while, you know that we don't shy away from covering the grim and the gory details of history. But I have to warn you that this episode has more than a few of those. More than the number of grim and gory details that we've so far had, at least in the Henry VIII series. So if you're looking for something cheerful and upbeat, maybe this is not the podcast for you to listen to today. With that said, we're going to open this fifth and final episode with an account of an execution that happens in England. I'm going to paraphrase here from the original text because it was written in the 1600s and the English of that time is not as straightforward for people these days to understand. While I might not be giving you the word-for-word quote from this several centuries old text, the meaning will be exactly the same. This is an account of the execution of Bishop Hooper, who was an official in the Church of England. It was about 8 o'clock on February 9th, 1555. He was led forward and many thousand people were collected as it was market day. All the way, being forbidden to speak, and looking at the people who mourned bitterly for him, he would sometimes lift up his eyes toward heaven and look very cheerfully upon those people that he recognized. And he was never known, during all the time that people had been familiar with him, to look as cheerful as he did on this day. When he came to the place appointed where he should die, he smilingly looked at the stake and the preparations being made for him, which was near a great elm tree beside the college of priests where he used to preach. Now, after he had entered into prayer, a box was brought and laid in front of him, and it contained his pardon from the Queen, if he would repent. At the sight of this, he cried, "If you love my soul, take this away." The box being taken away, Lord Chandos said, "Seeing as there's no remedy, execute him at once." Command was now given that the fire should be lit. But because there were not more green logs than 2 horses could carry, it did not light quickly, and it was a long time before the fire took to the reeds upon the logs. Finally, it burned around him. But the wind having full strength in that place, and it being a windy, cold morning, blew the flame away from him, so that he was little more than touched by the fire. Soon after, more dry logs were brought, and a new fire was lit, and this burned near the lower part of his body, but had small power toward the upper part of his body because of the wind, except that it burned his hair and scorched his skin a little. As the fire was burning, even when the first flames reached him, he prayed, saying mildly and not very loud, but as one who was not in pain, "O Jesus, Son of David, have mercy upon me and receive my soul." After the second fire blew out, he wiped both his eyes with his hands, and looking at the people, he said with an indifferent loud voice, "For God's love, good people, let me have more fire." And all this while his lower parts were burning, but the logs were so few that the flames only singed the upper parts of his body. A third time the fire was lit, and after a while this was more extreme and successful than the other 2. In this fire he prayed with a loud voice, "Lord Jesus, have mercy upon me. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And these were the last words he was heard to utter. But when he was black in the mouth, and his tongue so swollen that he could not speak, yet his lips went till they were shrunk to the gums, and he knocked his chest with his hands until one of his arms fell off, and then knocked still with the other, while the fat, water, and blood dropped out at his fingers' ends. Until the fire was renewed again, his strength was gone, and his hand stuck fast to the iron upon his chest. Then immediately, bowing forwards, he yielded up his spirit and died. So this is an account of a man being burned at the stake. And this execution was not exceptional. It wasn't especially cruel. It wasn't a particularly awful punishment that had been reserved just for him. This burning at the stake was a very common method of execution for heretics in England at this time. And what you can see from this account is that it was a drawn out and a ghastly process. The fire is lit here on 3 separate occasions, and it's not at all something where the victim is just tied to the stake, they light the fire, that they douse him in gasoline, and everything goes up very quickly. This took a long time. Parts of his body were essentially being broiled over a slow flame that was enough to cause all kinds of damage and agony, but not enough to kill him. So it was a horrible way to die, and we can tell from this account that the victim is fully conscious, even as his tongue is too swollen to speak, even as the gums and the lips around his face, this flesh has shriveled and been singed by fire. The victim is fully conscious. And the horror of such a death was something that was intended to terrify people. And that's really the reason for this method of execution. So Bishop Hooper is one of hundreds of people who are going to suffer this grim fate at this point in time in England. And this is where our story opens, because England is on fire. People are being executed at the stake across the country. Why? That's the story that we're going to tell today. So in 1547, Henry VIII is dead. And as you will recall from watching the other episodes in this series, Henry's major legacy is not the number of wives that he had. It's the way that he redirected the fate of England by separating it from the authority of the Pope and from membership in the Roman Catholic Church, which was the Christian church at the time. And in doing this, Henry VIII had thrown England's lot in with the Protestant Reformation, with this new understanding of Christianity that was springing up across Europe and dispensed with the Pope and with the institutions and hierarchies and authority of the established church. And of course, it was convenient for Henry to do this. He had reasons of his own, such as the desire to marry a woman that the Pope wasn't going to allow him to do. But Henry's personal motives aside, the legacy he left behind for England was incredibly important because Europe has changed in the lifetime of Henry VIII. And many other countries are now wrestling with the same questions about religious authority and about the way that they should understand their faith. And these new communities of Protestants or Protestants, which is where the name derives from, are springing up all over Europe in many other countries. And now there are these new problems that didn't exist before. There had always been heretics, small groups of people whose religious understandings deviated from Catholic orthodoxy. And those people had been fairly easy to deal with over the centuries. They could be suppressed, they could be eliminated. But what makes this moment in history different is that there are just far too many Protestants to deal with them in the same way that heresy has been dealt with before. Which is, of course, isn't going to prevent monarchs from trying. And that's part of our story today. But let me backtrack a little bit. Henry's dead in 1547. His one legitimate son, Edward VI, inherits the throne. And Edward has been born into Protestant England. It's all he's ever known. And he hasn't been around to know things for very long because he's only 9 years old when he inherits the throne. So what this means is that he becomes a figurehead for carrying through the policies that his father initiated. But in practice, most of those policies are being defended and championed by Protestant nobles who've been empowered by Henry's policies and who now hold influential positions in court. And even though Edward VI is recognized as the king's legitimate heir, everyone knows that a 9-year-old isn't competent to make all the decisions of state. And so there's a Lord Protector who's appointed to deal with the serious decisions until such time as the young king attains the age of majority. Now, Edward VI also has 2 older sisters, and you might remember that these are children from Henry VIII's previous marriages. There's Mary Tudor, who's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, and according to Catholics, his only legitimate wife. So she's the eldest, but she's been passed over. She does not inherit the throne. And the second child is Elizabeth, who's the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, the one he separated from the Catholic Church to marry. And her mother, Anne Boleyn, you might recall, was beheaded. So these are 2 princesses who are undeniably the children of Henry VIII. They are part of his bloodline, but they've been passed over in favor of this third child, Edward, because he is a boy. And England has never before been ruled by a queen in her own right. It's had queens, of course, but those queens have been married to kings, and the kings have held the power. So it's 9-year-old Edward who inherits the throne, not his older sisters, who are both nearly adults at this point. So under the reign of Edward VI, ostensibly, or rather the Lord Protector, who his maternal uncle, who was actually making the decisions, Protestant reforms continue in English churches. And what this means essentially is that things like stained glass and statues, for example, are stripped away from English churches. Why? Well, because Protestant reformers in other parts of Europe associated stained glass and statues with what they thought of as idolatrous Catholic practices. Basically, the idea was that these images became the focus of prayer and piety and distracted the faithful from giving their full attention to God, who of course is invisible and can't be captured in an image or a painting or a statue. And so Protestant thinking was that a lot of these very beautiful adornments that had been part of Catholic churches for centuries needed to be eliminated. And so we see that beginning to happen in English churches at this time. In addition, the Church of England receives a new Book of Common Prayer. And this is penned by a man named Thomas Cranmer. Now, you might remember Cranmer from some of our previous episodes. When Henry decided to create the Church of England so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cranmer became its highest official. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and really the religious official in charge of the church under the king himself. So Thomas Cranmer is the one who basically is in charge of instituting religious change and policies once the monarch has approved those things. So he's very much the face of the Church of England, and it's from him that this new Book of Common Prayer emerges and is then distributed to all the churches in England as the new book that they are required to use in their services. So it gets rid of some of the existing traditional prayers that might have been associated with Catholic traditions, and it replaces them with more reformist versions. In addition to this, ideas around practices that were happening in churches in England were radically revised. For example, the idea of communion. Now, in the Catholic tradition, communion involves small amounts of wine and a wafer, which is sort of placed in the mouth of individuals by the priest, and it's a very solemn ceremony in which the body and blood of Jesus Christ are thought to be somehow present in that ceremony in a physical way. And this is something that Protestant reformers took issue with, and they said, this is ridiculous. This is just a wafer, and this is just a bit of wine. It's only symbolic. There is no magical, mystical way in which the actual body and blood of Jesus becomes present at the time that the ceremony of communion takes place. So teachings around communion, which had been going on for centuries, are now instructing people in the churches of England to think about it very differently. think about it in a more reformist Protestant way. And this goes in the face of centuries of tradition. And to cap it all off, priests in the Church of England were now allowed to marry. And this flew in the face of celibacy, which had been the tradition for priests in the Catholic Church for as long as anyone could remember. So the idea that if you were a priest in the Church of England, you were now allowed to have a wife, this was radically different. It was a sign of just how pronounced reformist ideas in England were becoming. There were many people who did not at all recognize the traditions that they had followed for centuries any longer in the Church of England. But all of this wasn't to last very long. Edward is only 15 when he contracts tuberculosis. And so he becomes very, very sick. And the Protestant nobles around him, including the Lord Protector, become extremely concerned. Because if this young man should die, the next person in line to the throne is his oldest sister. That would be Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. And Mary is a hardcore Catholic. She's held on to her Catholic identity and the upbringing that her mother gave her in the face of all the changes that have happened in England since Henry divorced Catherine of Aragon and has made England officially Protestant and has had all these other Protestant wives and Protestant nobles and a Church of England. And there's been a whole lot of pressure on everybody to get with the program and march in step with the new Church of England under the King. Mary Tudor has resisted all of these things all her life. And everybody knows it. So there is this deep feeling of anxiety that descends on the Protestant nobles at court when they face the very real possibility that Edward is going to die and Mary is going to inherit the throne. They are under no illusions that she will overturn absolutely everything that's been going on in terms of Protestant Church of England policy. So they come up with a desperate plan. They go to the dying young teenage king, Edward, and they say, listen, Henry VIII, your father, willed the throne to you, but next in line is your oldest sister and then the second sister. This will be a disaster. So can you, Edward, sign this paper saying that you want your Protestant cousin, Jane, to inherit the throne next? Their plan is that if they can get the king, the teenage king, to sign this document, they can bypass Mary and they can keep everything safe by having a Protestant female monarch to kind of safeguard all these reforms. It would be unprecedented to have a woman inherit the throne, true, but seeing as a woman was going to inherit the throne anyway, better a Protestant woman than a Catholic one in their view. Edward's cousin is a young woman named Jane Grey, and she's about the same age as Edward, really only 15. So she's very much under the sway of her powerful father and these other Protestant nobles around the court who are saying to her, listen, you need to accept this. It's very important for the future of the country and for the future of your faith. So while she's initially reluctant and reportedly faints when the idea is first stated to her, she does eventually agree to accept the crown. And sure enough, after signing this paper, Edward VI dies and Lady Jane is crowned Queen of England. So this is in 1553, and Jane has just been crowned, but the people of England all know who the rightful successor is. Nobody is fooled by this sudden scrambling. Lady Jane's father supported it. Powerful Protestant nobles at court supported it. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of the Church of England, of course supported it. But the everyday people in England knew that the rightful succession had been bypassed, that there were children of Henry VIII who stood to inherit the crown, and this hasty shuffling to put it on somebody else's head was met with stony silence. In fact, Lady Jane Grey wore the crown for only 9 days. What happened was that Mary Tudor, the firstborn child of Henry VIII, rode into London with an entourage to claim the crown that was her birthright. And she was greeted with jubilation. Everyone knew who she was. And while her faith tradition might have been different from official English policy, it was undeniable that she was the daughter of the king. So, very quickly, the people who had supported Jane Grey at court capitulated. They recognized Mary, and Jane Grey, this 15-year-old hapless teenager, was thrown into the Tower of London for treason, along with members of her family and her husband. Mary Tudor claims the crown that is her birthright at last. And it must have been an incredibly triumphant moment for her personally, because Mary had endured slights and she had endured disgrace repeatedly since her father Henry had divorced her mother, Catherine of Aragon. At various points, as Henry had been changing wives and having other children, he had disowned Mary. He had declared her a bastard and outside the succession when it suited him to pretend that his marriage to her mother had never been legitimate. And so, while she was finally reinstated in her father's will before he died, she had had to endure these periods of isolation, disgrace, having the title of princess stripped from her, having her mother called an illegitimate wife and herself a bastard. And so to finally inherit that throne and to be Queen of England in her own right must have been a very sweet victory for Mary at this point in her life. As for Jane Grey, who had had Mary's crown dropped somewhat reluctantly on her head, she was beheaded for treason. And her short life is sort of a tragic testimony to her being a pawn in the power games of the older men around her. She hadn't really wanted to be queen. She'd been made queen because it suited the interests of powerful Protestants. And now that Mary had returned to claim what was hers, she was going to lose her head for having allowed the crown to rest upon it. When Mary Tudor takes the throne, she plans to restore England to the way it was when her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was queen. Mary has always stayed faithful to the true church, the Catholic Church. And through all these years, as her father has taken England away from the Catholic Church, repudiated the Pope, built the Church of England, and required English people to affirm its legitimacy, Mary has remained stubbornly Catholic. And she's endured a lot of criticism for that. She's endured isolation, ridicule, and even times when she's been stripped of her title as a princess and declared a bastard at different points in her father's marital adventures, as he was marrying new women and hoping to have other children and trying to clear the line of succession of inconvenient children from previous marriages. Mary has had this extremely bumpy ride where even though she's the firstborn child of the King of England, there have been times when she's not even been recognized as a princess. So it must have been a very sweet moment of victory for her, at long last, when her younger brother dies and this pretender Jane Grey has been removed to finally inherit her father's crown and his throne, and to have in her own hands the power to reshape England. It's not hard to understand Mary's position. In her mind, there's only ever been one true church, and that's the Catholic Church. And even her father, Henry VIII, had recognized that and defended it until he'd become bewitched by that abominably Protestant Anne Boleyn and had been led down the path of religious error and heresies by that wicked woman Anne Boleyn and the other enemies of the true church. So from Mary's perspective, her father's waywardness has been the real cause of all this religious change in England, and she sees her own role as one of a restorer and perhaps even of a liberator for the English people who've been subject and forcibly required to go down this path. Indeed, there were many good Catholics who went to their deaths for refusing to go along with Henry at various points. When Henry VIII created the Act of Supremacy and he required English subjects to swear an oath that affirmed that he, the king, was the head of the church, not the Pope, and that Anne Boleyn was the legitimate wife and Queen of England and not Catherine, there had been some very stubborn Catholic holdouts, including a man named Bishop Fisher, who was very highly placed, and Thomas More, who was a scholar and a churchman and a friend of Henry VIII. And for their refusal to comply, they lost their heads. So while most people in England had gone along with this, Mary might rightly have supposed it was because they preferred not to suffer terrible punishments and carry on with their lives, but that deep in their hearts they were longing for the day when they could return to practicing the one true faith in freedom and in public. And Mary saw it as her duty to give them back that opportunity. Within the first 2 years of her reign, Mary passes 2 acts of repeal, which are laws that specifically and deliberately undo the religious reforms and the Church of England that had been created by Henry VIII and continued under his son, Edward VI. She even tries to undo Henry's dissolution of monasteries, which we covered in a previous episode when Henry had seized a lot of church property and then sold it off to English noblemen. So Mary goes to these noblemen and she tries to persuade them to hand back this church property that they've purchased, which Mary and the Pope would think they never had a right to because it didn't belong to the king to sell to them. Unfortunately, people weren't anxious to comply. Wealthy aristocrats who had become richer by acquiring these lands were in no hurry to hand them back just because the Pope and the Queen thought that that was the right way of doing things. Now, Mary is 37 when she inherits the throne, and she's acutely aware that if she dies childless, the person who's next in line is her half-sister Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is the child of her father Henry and that Anne Boleyn woman that Mary doubtlessly hated. Even worse, Elizabeth has been raised as a Protestant. And so she's certainly not going to continue the restoration of Catholicism in England, which is Mary's dearest project. So in order to protect the legacy that she's trying to create, it is of paramount importance that Mary produce a child. And of course, for that, she will need a husband. Now, unlike her father, Henry VIII, Mary's decision about who to marry will be guided entirely by her political values. Henry had the latitude to sometimes be guided by his wayward eye or his libido, and to make choices that didn't bring strong political and diplomatic benefits to England. But Mary has no such luxury. Her choice of mate will be determined by who she thinks will be the strongest ally in her project of restoring Catholicism. And so she quite logically chooses the Spanish king, Philip II, as her husband-to-be. Now, this is enormously unpopular in England. And it's unpopular because, in part, of gender norms at the time. In the 16th century, people firmly believed that the wife was simply a subordinate of the husband. And so whatever the husband's wishes, desires, or policies would be, the wife would simply follow them unquestioningly, that she had no independent will or agency of her own. For Englishmen, the prospect of their queen, Mary, becoming the wife of the King of Spain meant that she would be subordinate to him, and therefore that England would be subordinate to Spain. This horrible prospect of England becoming just a satellite state of Spain was what many people feared as a result of this marriage. And it wasn't a groundless fear. Spain at the time was perhaps the most powerful country in Europe. Remember that Mary Tudor's grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, had been busy commissioning Christopher Columbus to go explore or discover the New World, and they'd sent out any number of other Spanish conquistadores who landed on the shores of the New World, discovering it, and then claiming it as Spanish property. And at this point in time, Spain is very busy extracting wealth from these places in the form of silver and slave labor and jewels and so on, spices. Spain is an early mover in terms of exploration and colonization. And as a result, it's very wealthy. So for England, Spain represents a very powerful alliance, but certainly the threat of being overshadowed and swallowed up by Spain is not hard to understand. Despite this opposition, Mary weds Philip of Spain. And after the ceremony, Mary remains in England doing Queen of England things, and Philip II returns to Spain doing King of Spain things. And he doesn't end up in England very often to visit his new wife. So, uncoincidentally, she doesn't manage to get pregnant. She didn't have too many opportunities. So, it certainly wasn't a happy marriage, but happiness was never really the point anyway. The point of this was a political alliance, and at least for Mary, the real point was to produce an heir. And from that point of view, the marriage was a dismal failure. Mary's fervor and her determination to restore Catholicism to England is perhaps the reason that it backfired. That in her stubborn determination to marry Philip and to reassert the authority of the Pope in England, she may have inadvertently associated Catholicism with the imposition of foreign powers. Philip of Spain and the Pope in Rome, these sort of external foreign influences that were forcing policy changes or exerting their will on Englishmen. It was perhaps the unintended outcome of Mary's actions that Protestantism becomes ever more firmly associated with a sense of English nationalism. That the idea that this Protestantism, this Church of England, is associated with really being English. And this Catholic stuff is what the Spanish and those Italians in Rome and other people are trying to force on us. So she may actually have firmly entrenched this idea in a way that it might not have been as firmly associated before. And Mary perhaps failed to recognize that things in England had changed from the time that her father opened the gate by removing England from the Catholic Church. I mean, at the time, there were plenty of good Catholics in England who resisted and paid a high price. But when Henry had opened that door for his own personal reasons, he found it convenient to get away from the Pope, he also opened the floodgates to allowing Protestant ideas to circulate in England, because in some ways they had official permission to do so. The state was no longer in the business of enforcing Catholic religious orthodoxy. And so the reformist ideas that are circulating on the continent, especially in Germany, the writings of Martin Luther and Zwingli in Switzerland and other places, they begin to flood into England, not just as small, underground, forbidden books, but things that people can now circulate much more rapidly and much more openly. And remember, this is the era of the printing press. So the mass distribution of these writings is now possible. And some of these reformers, who we talked about in previous episodes, have translated the Bible into English as well. And so, as a result of Henry's shifting of England away from the Catholic Church, he's opened a door that's exposed the population of England to these ideas. And for reasons of their own that are entirely unconnected to the king's personal motivations, many of them may have been inspired by these ideas. And these ideas were on fire all over Europe. I mean, people were seizing on the emphasis on individualism, the idea that the average man and woman could have access to the Bible in their own language, read it, and decide what it meant for themselves, instead of listening to church services in a language like Latin that they didn't understand and being told by a priest what they ought to think about what Christianity meant. Instead of this, they would have direct access. This was something that Protestant ideas offered, and it was enormously attractive. So while Mary would have been correct in her belief that many English people would have resented what her father did at the time that he opened that door, she had perhaps failed to realize that water had passed under the bridge since then, and that many English people had perhaps changed their ideas around religion. So when Mary now tries to roll back the clock and reinstitute Catholicism, she's entirely unprepared for the amount of resistance she's going to encounter. Mary decides that what the English need is a good, sharp nudge in the right direction. And to create this, she revives some old laws from the 1400s. These laws define heresy as any religious belief, teaching, or practice that is different from the religion of the monarch. And the monarch at this moment is Mary, and her religion is Catholicism, which is defined by the Pope. So anybody in England who's practicing, preaching, or believing something that deviates from the teachings of the Pope is now, by definition, a heretic. And the penalties for being a heretic are extremely severe. Now, let's pause for a moment to think about just how surreal and chaotic this must have seemed to the average Englishman or Englishwoman. I mean, at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, England was a Catholic country, as were all the countries in Western Europe. Somewhere in the middle of his reign, he forcibly takes England away from the Catholic fold and makes it essentially a Protestant country. And so everyone has to get used to this new oath and this new structure, and Henry's radically reshaping religion. He's getting rid of monasteries. He's frowning on pilgrimages. That there are priests that are getting married. There are new books of common prayer. Everyone's trying to get used to this new way of doing things and to watching traditions that they've observed in England for centuries disappear. So that's been going on for a few decades. And now suddenly Mary is ruling, and boom, everything is Catholic now. So what was down is now up, and what was up is down. England begins to resemble this great teeter-totter, like the ones you see on a child's playground, where there's just this sudden reversal, and things that were suppressed are now in power, and things that used to be in power, Protestant ideas in the state, are now about to be firmly and viciously suppressed. So at this point, with these new laws, if a person was accused of heresy, they would be brought in front of state officials, local officials. And this is something else that we have to pause to think about, because we think now of religion as a very personal and private matter. But at this point in history, religious practice and religious correctness is enforced by the state. It's something that is public and that can be regulated by law and that citizens can be forced to conform to. So if a person was accused of having heretical or incorrect ideas, they'd be brought before their local bailiffs or, state officials and questioned and required to recant or repent, to renounce those ideas and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong if I said anything like that. I'm a good Catholic. Let me prove it to you. And you'd be let go. But if you refused to cooperate, if you stubbornly adhered to these heretical ideas, then you'd be punished. And at a minimum, the punishment was forfeiture of property. So this meant that the state, the crown, would seize everything you owned, leaving you and your family destitute. There are no social safety nets in England at this time. If you're a farmer or a shoemaker and the objects that you use to make your living are seized, you're a beggar. It was extremely serious. And if you persisted in affirming these heretical ideas, you could be punished by death. And the death for heretics in England was most commonly burning at the stake. And that's that horrifying, drawn-out, agonizing form of execution that we described at the beginning of this episode. There are accounts of more than 300 people in England in a few years' time who were burned at the stake for affirming Protestant ideas. And these include men and women. And they're not just, important officials or high-up nobles who need to be made an example of. These are everyday men and women, not rich, not powerful, no one important, just normal people, shoemakers, farmers, people who lived in towns and villages who would be hauled up in front of authorities for having the wrong religious ideas. And if they refused to repent of those ideas, would be executed in this horrible way. There's even a book about it that was written in the 1600s. It's called Fox's Book of Martyrs, and it gives very detailed accounts of the names of these people, their ages, their occupations, the circumstances under which they were hauled up in front of authorities, the details of the attempts that were made to force them to deny their Protestant ideas, and what happened when they refused. And these accounts include the last days, hours, and even moments of their lives. It's horrifying reading. But you can find this book and you can go through it. There's an account in it that I read as I was doing research for this episode that the horror of which remains with me. And it was an account of 3 women who were executed for being heretics on the island of Guernsey, which is just off the English coast. It's part of England, but it's a small island. So these 3 women, a mother and her 2 adult daughters, have been declared heretics. And so they're going to be executed as such. So the 3 women are taken and they're chained to stakes, and logs and reeds and flammable material is built up around them. And one of the adult daughters is heavily pregnant. So the executioners light the flammable material, the flames start rising, and in the agony of burning, the heavily pregnant woman gives birth. And there's a child that emerges from her body and is actually grabbed by a bystander out of the flames. And this newborn infant is then taken in front of the authority who was overseeing these executions. And according to Fox's Book of Martyrs, that authority said, throw the child back into the flames. It's the child of a heretic. It's a heretic child. It deserves to die like a heretic. This level of cruelty is just astonishing to think about. And these are people that had not committed any crime against the Queen or the state. They weren't plotting to kill anybody. They simply had the wrong religious ideas at this particular moment. And 3 years earlier, they'd had the right religious ideas. Their ideas hadn't changed, just the color of the state had changed. And now they were going to die for it in this horrible way. So in addition to the hundreds of people who went to the stake for their beliefs, there were far higher numbers of others who just left the country. They decided that death or becoming beggars, neither of these were a price they were willing to pay, so they just left the country with their families. So there's this diaspora or exodus of Protestant English people into other Reformed communities in Europe. Some of them go to Germany, some to the Netherlands, wherever they can go, where they can have their religious beliefs and not be at risk of execution for them. Now, of course, in addition to everyday English people, you can well imagine that Mary and the new regime had its sights set on some of the most prominent figureheads of the old system, and none was more prominent than Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of the Church of England. As I said earlier, he was the most recognizable face of the Church of England. He was the one who created the Book of Common Prayer, and Mary Tudor probably had a special animus for Thomas Cranmer, because he was the one that her father had created as Archbishop of Canterbury, because he needed somebody who would officially pronounce his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Mary's mother, illegitimate, and legitimize his marriage to Anne Boleyn. So Thomas Cranmer had been that hand. Thomas Cranmer had been the useful tool for Henry VIII to accomplish these goals, and he'd then been in charge of all the religious reforms since then. Furthermore, he had supported the plan to put the crown of England on the head of Jane Grey. So from Mary Tudor's perspective, Thomas Cranmer is an arch-villain. He's basically been instrumental in trying to destroy her mother, herself, and all of England with his evil heretical ideas. So it's unsurprising that his name was perhaps near the top of the list of people that she had special plans for when she became queen. Mary is determined to make an example of Thomas Cranmer. So of course he's arrested around about the same time that Jane Grey and other Protestants who've conspired to make her queen are. And Mary's staff of Catholic priests offer Thomas Cranmer a chance to save his life if he will sign statements that publicly recant everything he's ever done under the Church of England. So every religious reform that he has created, enacted, signed into law, pushed into practice, they want him to publicly condemn all of those things as terrible errors, grievous mistakes, crimes against the one true faith, and things that he no longer believes and wishes he had never done. So they say to him, you're going to die unless you sign these documents. And Thomas Cranmer has no desire to die this horrible death of being burned at the stake. I mean, who would? So he thinks that, well, if he signs these documents, then he'll be allowed to live. And he signs them. He signs repeated statements of this kind, which are then circulated by Mary's new religious officials as basically an example to others. Look, the head of your Church of England has said to you all that all of this was a mistake. It was a terrible error. Look, it's official. He said it's wrong. It's wrong. You all better fall into line. That was the idea. The first round of these recantations are circulated, and then the following month, Cranmer is still in prison, of course, he's required to sign even more of these with even more humiliating confessions and repentings of everything he's ever done and how all the Church of England was a big mistake. And Cranmer, who has no options really, signs those things as well. And then, on March 15th, 1556, Cranmer is brought into a church where Mary's religious officials read out his latest round of humiliating recantations. And then the official there who's in charge of this service says that Thomas Cranmer is going to be executed anyway, despite having signed these things and being promised privately that he would be allowed to live if he did so. So now he's finding out, actually, you're going to die anyway. We are going to execute you as a heretic, but don't worry. Because you've come back to the true faith, we'll all say masses for your soul, and you won't end up going to hell. When we finished burning you at the stake, you'll probably end up in heaven, or at least we will pray that you do. So take comfort in that. Thomas Cranmer has been disgraced, he's been imprisoned, he's been humiliated, and now he finds that despite his best efforts, he's still going to die this death. And so at this moment, he makes a decision. He'd been told by his jailers that he was going to be put up in front of the church and required to make one more humiliating speech about his own errors and the Church of England. And they'd sort of gone over the script with him in advance. This is the speech that you will give. To kind of, one more time verbally affirm that we were right and you were wrong. And so Cranmer, after hearing this, is now pushed up to the front of the church where he's supposed to give this speech. And what I'm going to read to you now is an eyewitness account written by a Catholic who was there. And we don't know the name of this individual, but they wrote a letter to a friend of theirs describing what they had seen at this particular moment. So that's what I'm going to read to you now. I'm going to try to amend some of the more archaic versions of these words so that what I render to you is slightly more comprehensible English, but none of the meanings are going to be changed. So Cranmer comes up to the front of the church and he says, "And now I come to the thing that troubles my conscience more than any other thing that I ever said or did in my life. And that is the circulation of writings that are not the truth, which here now I renounce and refuse as things that I wrote with my hand against the truth that I knew in my heart. And I wrote them for fear of death and to save my life if it were possible. And all such papers that I've written or signed with my own hand, since my humiliation, I have written many falsehoods there. And insofar as my hand has offended me in writing things that are against what is in my heart, my hand will be the first thing to be punished. For if I am going to go to the fire, my hand will be the first thing that will burn. And as for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy and Antichrist with all his false doctrine." And here he was then reminded by others that he had recanted and he had affirmed the authority of the Pope. And Cranmer said, "Alas, my lord, I have been a man that all my life loved to be honest, and I never until now said anything against the truth. And for these things I said, which were false, I am very sorry. So he's saying here the things that are false were the recantations he was forced to sign about the Pope being right and the Church of England being wrong. So it's a recantation of the recantation that's happening. So then Cranmer was carried away, and a great number of people ran to see him go to his death, begging him that while he still had time, he should remember himself and basically affirm the truth of Catholicism so that his soul wouldn't perish. And one Friar John, clearly a Catholic, a godly and educated man, walked alongside with Cranmer the whole way to try to persuade him. But he didn't succeed. Whatever they said in particular, I can't tell, says the letter writer. But the effect appeared at the end, for when Cranmer reached the stake, he said again that he died affirming everything that he had believed in his life, which was the Church of England, and repented again that he'd ever signed anything to the contrary. Coming to the stake with a cheerful expression and a willing attitude, he took off his external garments quickly and stood upright in his shirt. And a religious scholar attempted to persuade him again to his statements in support of the Catholic Church, alongside two Spanish friars who also attempted to persuade him. But when the friars saw that Thomas Cranmer would not be persuaded, they said, "Let us go away from him. We shouldn't be near him. The devil is with him." And yet again, the religious scholar tried to get Cranmer to affirm his former statements in favor of the Catholic Church. But Cranmer said, showing his hand, "This was the hand that wrote those things, and therefore shall it suffer first punishment." Fire was now lit around him, and he stretched out his right hand and put it into the flames, and held it there a good long time before the fire came close to any other part of his body. So his hand was clearly seen by the bystanders as burning, and crying with a loud voice, Cranmer said, "This hand has offended." And as soon as the fire increased, he was very soon dead, never stirring or crying all the while. And now the letter writer says, "Thus have I enforced myself for your sake to tell this heavy story, contrary to my mind, and being more than half weary, I make a short end, wishing you a quieter life, with less honor, and easier death, with more praise." Doubtless, there were many English people who wished for a quieter life with less honor and an easier death with more praise. Which begs the question, is there anything that you would be willing to die for? This is a question that's fascinated me as I go through these accounts, because for many English people, all that would have been required of them would be to play along. Now, Thomas Cranmer was a special case. The Queen was clearly intending to make an example of him, and even though he tried to save his life, there was no way out of it. They were going to burn him. So in many ways, he was trapped. And if he was going to die anyway, he might as well make a statement. That makes sense. But what's harder to understand is the will that many other common, poor, everyday English people demonstrated, and their refusal to go along with the current political trend of the moment. Their refusal to say, "I don't believe those Protestant things anymore. I'm a good Catholic. Yes, I'll go to Mass. I'll say a penance," and be let go. They were willing to stubbornly tell the truth about what they believed, even though they knew they were going to pay a terrible price for that. And I wonder if there's anything that you and I would affirm so strongly that we would be willing to voluntarily pay that price. It's a question worth asking. But clearly, there were significant numbers of people for whom the answer was yes, and that principles were more important to them than life itself. Perhaps the only vague parallel that we can come up with, and I hesitate to call it a parallel, but even the remotest comparison we have, are suicide bombers. And before you jump out of your chair spewing anger, bear with me for a second. I'm only suggesting that suicide bombers have one thing in common, which is to volunteer to end one's life in defense of some idea or cause without being soldiers, which of course is a special category. But I don't think that it's really a fair comparison because suicide bombers are completely volunteers. In most cases, unless you have someone who's being, forcibly grabbed and has things strapped to them and being pushed in at gunpoint. Unwilling civilians can be made into suicide bombers even though they have no desire to be such. I'm not referring to those people. I'm talking about the ones who plan and select themselves for these missions and know that they're going to end their lives because they believe that there's some other cause that makes it worth doing. But as I say, those people select themselves. And so there are different psychological elements, arguably, that are involved there. These people in England were not selecting themselves, really. They were everyday people just trying to go about their lives, minding their own business, and somebody else pointed them out to state authorities and said, that person is a heretic, or that person was not seen attending Mass, or this person has said things that are against the Pope. And so they were dragged in and asked and encouraged to, get rid of those statements and conform. And it was then that they refused. So they would have been very happy to be left alone. And many of them fled the country because they wanted to be left alone. So there's something very different there in that, in many ways, this was sort of brought to them, as opposed to a cause that they went and sought out or chased after. But it's still a fascinating and horrifying situation to contemplate. There are two other considerations that make English martyrs very different from suicide bombers. The first of those things is that a suicide bomber is going to die very quickly. They're going to be shot or they're going to be blown up, so it's a matter of a couple of seconds and it's over. For these people, the choice was conform or die a prolonged, absolutely agonizing and wretched death. So it's much more akin to volunteering for prolonged torture rather than just execution that's at stake here, no pun intended. And the other aspect is that in many cases, suicide bombers their families might be rewarded with some status or even some monetary support in exchange for the sacrifice of that member of their family that has gone and done this. In England at this time, it was exactly the opposite. A person who's dying by being burned at the stake has normally had all their property confiscated anyway. So they've left their family in utter destitution. And then they're removing themselves as one more person who could maybe, help support those people. So the cost is so much higher in so many other ways. And yet there are people that were willing to pay that price. As this period of religious persecution is unfolding in England, there are many, many people who are affected from the highest levels, like Thomas Cranmer, to the lowest levels. And even Princess Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, is not exempt from this. She's regarded with great suspicion by the Queen because she's known to be a Protestant. And while she's playing ball on the outside, meaning she's attending Mass, she's publicly seen to be conforming to the religious order, there are rumors that privately she says prayers in the Protestant fashion and that she has her own Bible in English, and that, while she might be conforming on the outside, she's really a Protestant at heart. And so a great many people in England look at Elizabeth as the focus of hope because they know that she's the next in line to the throne. And they know she's not a Catholic. And so there's this sense of longing for her to inherit that throne because she is seen or expected to be a relief from this Catholic enforcement that Mary Tudor is currently instituting. The Queen is very suspicious that Elizabeth might actually use this influence and this popularity to instigate a rebellion and to overthrow Mary as Queen. So she's watching her half-sister with a very close and a very suspicious eye. But as it turns out, it was unnecessary for Elizabeth to instigate a rebellion. Mary died after only 5 years on the throne. She died in November 1558, and historians suspect that it was ovarian cancer that killed her. So Mary rules from the age of 37 to the age of 42, and that's the end of her short but terrifying stint as Queen of England. Mary Tudor dies childless, so she doesn't have an heir to protect her Catholic restoration project. But history remembers her as Bloody Mary because of the ardor and the flame that she brought to enforcing Catholic orthodoxy on English citizens. So Elizabeth inherits the throne in this same year, 1558, and she's only 25 years old when she takes the throne. She will end up being one of England's longest reigning monarchs because her reign goes on until 1603. So she presides over a very long period of political stability. But the question that's in everyone's mind as she comes to the throne is, what next? Is the political teeter-totter going to go in exactly the opposite direction? And will Elizabeth now run around enforcing Protestant orthodoxy and burning Catholics at the stake? Is that what's happening next? This is the fear that doubtless was in the minds of many English Catholics who had benefited under Mary's reign and now worried that it would be visited upon them what had been done to Protestants under Mary. Elizabeth's choice will determine the fate of England, and it's complicated because her subjects themselves are divided. Some of them are fervent Catholics, and others are extremely convicted Protestants. So whatever choice she makes as official policy will benefit some and disadvantage others. But quite apart from what goes on inside her country, her choice will determine where England stands internationally as well, because Protestant ideas are now found in many different countries and they are dividing other national communities. Some states have become Protestant, others remain Catholic, and so England's official position will align it politically with some countries and automatically place it in an adversarial position to others. It's a very significant fork in the road that Elizabeth has to stand at, and the direction she takes is going to have repercussions, some of which she can predict and others which she cannot. Elizabeth is facing a relatively new problem, this religious division within her country. Widespread religious division. There had always been religious communities that were different. Some variation of heretics had been around for hundreds of years, but prior to this moment in history, heretics were small communities that could be dealt with easily. For example, in southern France, there had been the Cathar communities, sometimes called Albigensians, in the 12th and 13th century. And it had been a fairly easy matter for the Pope to decide that they needed to be suppressed and eventually eliminated, and those communities were butchered. And that's how that heresy was suppressed. So it wasn't really allowed to spread or grow and gain significant traction. And in England, in the 1400s, we saw the Lollards under John Wycliffe. And these, again, were people who were branded as heretics. They had many criticisms of the Catholic Church and the Pope. John Wycliffe had tried to translate the Bible into English, but while he had escaped execution as a heretic, many of his followers did not. So the state had been able to successfully clamp down on that community and prevent their ideas from circulating in any widespread sort of way. Western Europe, all of it, had been Catholic for centuries. And this religious unity, this one faith that was the same for the king as it was for his subjects and for all countries under the Pope in Western Europe, had been a powerful force that had even allowed these countries to unite against external powers, such as the Crusades in the 12th and 13th centuries, when the Pope had been able to rally a number of European countries to send forces against powers in the Middle East. This idea of religious unity had been the dominant framework in Europe for centuries. Small pockets of dissent, easily quashed, but a widespread shared set of ideas and a hierarchy. The subject under the kings under the Pope, one faith for all. That is over. Elizabeth and her contemporaries are living in a Europe that is fractured and fragmented by this new version of Christianity, which is radically at odds with Catholic traditions. And it's spread far more widely and has taken far deeper roots than any other form of what the Pope would have called heresy before. And the results of this are going to be profound, not just for England. Entire countries are now calling themselves Protestant. Germany, Estonia, Latvia, until recently England, and certainly the Netherlands are just a few examples of countries that are officially outside the Catholic tradition, do not recognize the Pope, and identify as Protestant. And in other staunchly Catholic countries like France, there are now significant Protestant communities, who we'll come to know as the Huguenots in France, who pose a threat to the religious identity of the state and the dominant narrative. These competing religious identities are about to tear Europe apart. Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558. But by 1560, only 2 years later, these competing religious identities are going to tear Europe apart in an incredibly violent epoch called the Wars of Religion, which is going to go on for more than 100 years. Only 3 years before Elizabeth becomes queen, in 1555, there's a very significant settlement that's been reached just next door in a strange political entity called the Holy Roman Empire. But it's basically a collection of states that we would now call modern Germany. And that area had been a hotbed of Martin Luther and Protestant teachings. So it was a collection of smaller states, each with their own prince. And it was governed by the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who was a Catholic. But some of those German states now had very Protestant princes and very Protestant populations. So the Holy Roman Empire had reached the settlement in 1555, which basically said, and there's a Latin version of this, but I'll give you the English translation, one ruler, one religion, or the religion of the state shall be the religion of the ruler. It was a recognition that if the local ruler was a Protestant, then he now had the freedom to support Protestant teaching and practice in his principality or his territory, instead of having to be subject to the Catholicism of the emperor himself. This idea of one ruler, one religion had been the case for a long time, but there'd only ever been one religion, which was Catholic Christianity. Now, that principle was being applied in some areas to allow certain rulers to have a Protestant religious identity, and this is going to be where the conflict takes off. In some ways, this principle of the faith of the ruler is the faith of the people, this principle had been held by both Henry VIII and his daughter Mary. The difference was that when Henry decided on the Church of England, he required all of his subjects to follow him. And when Mary decided it was going to be the Catholic Church, she required all of her subjects to follow her. The freedom for individuals to decide their own religious practices and beliefs was not officially recognized. That's the moment that we're living in at this point. And the attempt to enforce religious uniformity and subjects following the practices of the ruler is going to have enormous cost in human lives. 50 years ago in Spain, when it was ruled by Mary Tudor's grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, there'd been a very concerted campaign to enforce religious and political conformity. You've heard of this campaign. It's called the Spanish Inquisition, and it went on for more than 3 centuries. But it began under Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1502, they succeeded in expelling all the Muslims from Spain, and certain parts of Spain had been ruled by Muslims. It wasn't just that they had Muslim citizens in there. There were parts of Spain that were entirely Muslim, politically downwards. So Ferdinand and Isabella pushed all Muslims out of Spain, and then the remaining population were Jews and Christians, and they became subject to this horrifying campaign to enforce religious purity that we know as the Spanish Inquisition. And you had priests and inquisitors, that's what their title was if they were in charge of running this campaign, who were empowered by the state to examine the religious purity of Spanish subjects, to torture, interrogate, and execute people who were found to have the wrong ideas. And the number of people who died over the 3 centuries that this policy was running in Spain is absolutely horrifying. But these are the pangs of revolution that are breaking out across Europe as this old model of the king enforcing one religion as a matter of citizenship and national belonging are challenged by the emergence of Protestantism, which makes that effectively impossible. But there's a long period when the powers that be are going to try really hard to assert that old model, and that's going to result in this absolute bloodbath across Europe that we now call the Wars of Religion. Elizabeth I, surrounded by Europe that's very much in the throes of this struggle and these aspects of political and religious revolution, makes an important choice. She decides that she's not going to follow exactly the same path that her father, Henry VIII, and her sister Mary did. She famously says, "I will make no windows into the souls of men." And by this she meant that she wasn't interested in people's private religious beliefs. So in this sense, she's different from her sister Mary. But she's not that different from Henry VIII, because what she does is she brings back the oath of supremacy that her father had invented. And that oath affirms that the monarch of England is the head of the Church of England, not the Pope, and that the monarch has complete authority to determine what is right and wrong in that church, and that the allegiance of the English man and woman is to that monarch first and foremost. So Elizabeth will require political, not religious unity. So long as people are willing to take this oath, affirming the Queen as the highest political and religious authority in the land, they can go about their lives. But she absolutely requires that her subjects are loyal first to her and not to any external power like the Pope. Anyone who wanted to hold public office or religious office in England was required to take this oath, and within a couple of years it was expanded and then applied to anyone who wanted to be a member of parliament or even to get a university degree. So it was really a barrier for devout Catholics. If they weren't willing to affirm the Queen as the highest authority, then they would find themselves excluded from positions of influence. So in some ways it functioned as a filter, which kept devout Catholics, ones who were loyal first to the Pope, out of important positions. In addition, Elizabeth did require outward religious conformity. So a year after her coming to the throne in 1559, she passes the Act of Uniformity. And this actually requires all English subjects by law to attend Church of England services at their local church. And of course, for Catholics, Church of England services would be heretical in their view, right? They would involve teachings and interpretations that diverged from those of the Pope and from Catholic tradition. So this was problematic for English Catholics. However, if you failed to show up at these church services, you simply had to pay a fine. So there was a monetary cost to refusing to outwardly conform to Church of England practice, but no one was going to be burned at the stake for it. That was the difference. There were significant numbers of English people who refused to go to Church of England services. They were Catholics. They didn't want to go because they thought it was wrong, and they paid the fines. So they were known as recusant Catholics. Anyone who wasn't showing up and was paying a fine was basically identifying themselves as a Catholic. So being a Catholic did mean that you had fewer opportunities. There were many jobs and even university degrees you couldn't get. There was an economic cost to it, but you weren't having all your property confiscated and you weren't being dragged off to be burned at the stake. That was the difference. So you could be a Catholic in England. You could even be known to be a Catholic. You just couldn't go around preaching Catholicism in public and trying to convert other people to your tradition and increase its numbers. That was the difference. And so in allowing Catholics to exist in England, even under these diminished conditions, Elizabeth was taking a path that was different from her father and her sister. This didn't apply to Catholic priests, however. Catholic priests who were found in England were still subject to arrest and execution because they were seen as agents of a foreign power. A Catholic priest, by definition, was someone who would have to get their training and their authority outside of England, and they'd be coming there as people who were, by their very identity, loyal to the Pope first, and attempting to persuade English people to follow suit. So Catholic priests were still identified as hostile foreign agents, but there are many accounts of recusant English families, these English Catholics, who built hiding places in their houses for these Catholic priests, who harbored them, Catholic priests existing undercover with assumed identities and saying Mass and observing Catholic traditions in private. The presence of Catholic priests was, of course, necessary for Catholic Mass and for the administering of sacraments like communion. So it was necessary for English Catholics to harbor these priests. But that was something they had to be very covert about doing. As it turned out, suspicion of Catholic priests as agents of a hostile foreign power wasn't paranoia on Elizabeth's part. In 1570, 12 years after she becomes Queen of England, Pope Pius V excommunicates her. Now, this is the most serious thing that a pope could do to a monarch, because basically what it meant was the pope was saying, I, by my religious authority, I am the highest religious authority in the Christian world, am saying that this king or queen has no right to rule. The pope said that Elizabeth was a heretic and an abettor of heretics, and that she had no right to be queen. By making this excommunication of her official and public, he was also absolving her subjects of any allegiance to her. He was saying, you have no duty to be loyal to this queen. She's not a legitimate queen. She's an evil queen. She has no right to rule. So not only do you not have to obey her, but if the opportunity should come up where you could kill her, that could be fine, so that she could be replaced by a Catholic monarch. It was extremely serious. And when the Pope did this, of course, the situation for Catholics in England became a lot worse. The suspicion with which Elizabeth and her officials then regarded English Catholics was ratcheted up several notches after that pronouncement, because it was essentially like saying it was open season on Elizabeth. For any hidden Catholic to take an opportunity, they would have the Pope's blessing. So Elizabeth, as a Protestant ruler, has to be constantly vigilant against Catholic plots to get rid of her, especially after the excommunication. And she's always having to worry about whether there'll be some other Catholic candidate that people will conspire to replace her with. And it turns out that she has a cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, who fits the bill perfectly. Don't confuse her with Mary Tudor, who's already dead. Mary Tudor was the Catholic Queen of England who died. Elizabeth inherits the throne. But she now has a cousin, also called Mary, in Scotland, also a Catholic. There actually is a suspected plot to replace Elizabeth with Mary. So Elizabeth and her agents constantly have to be on the lookout for this, because who rules England doesn't just affect the situation of English Catholics, but it affects whose allies and whose enemies England will have internationally as well. So foreign powers also have an interest in the religious identity of the Queen or King of England. For example, Spain would have been extremely happy to see Protestant Elizabeth replaced with Mary Queen of Scots or some other religiously correct candidate. And so there's this constant worry about not just hostile elements from within England, Catholics who would be involved in this, but with foreign support for these plots as well. Those who plot against Elizabeth's rule are often Catholics, but not all Catholics are plotting against Elizabeth's rule. So if there are Catholics who are found guilty of having engaged in treasonous plots against the Queen, they are executed for treasonous plots against the Queen. But they're not executed just for being Catholic, and that's the significant difference. Many Protestants who went into exile under Mary Tudor's Catholic rule return to their country when Elizabeth becomes queen. So what they bring back with them is an even more convicted, hardcore version of Protestantism than what they left with. The Church of England that Henry VIII had created was something of a combination of some Catholic traditions and some Protestant ideas. It was very much in between these two worlds. But the Protestants that leave England, when it takes a swing towards Catholicism under Mary, become much more Protestant than they ever were before. And when they come back to an England that is uneasily trying to straddle the religious differences of its population, with a uniform Church of England that is not as Protestant as some Protestants in Europe, but not Catholic either. Something that has elements of both. And for these newly re-energized Protestants coming home, it's not Protestant enough. Ultimately, these increasingly stern Protestants who've returned will form their own factions within England, and they'll be pushing for more religious reform, for more strict Protestantism in the Church of England, which is still too much of a halfway for them. There will also be ongoing animosity against some English Catholics who will be seen as potential traitors and secret agents of Rome, who might not be loyal enough to the Queen and their own country. But a new divide is going to form between these hardcore Protestant reformers and the more traditional English Protestants of the Church of England who never left their home country. And the hardcore reformers will eventually earn the pejorative title Puritans as the years roll on. And there will be animosity between mainstream Church of England Protestants and these more convicted Puritan types. The seeds of that division will eventually blossom into the English Civil War. But that's going to take another 2 generations. The English Civil War doesn't break open until 1642 to 1651. But the seeds of that division are sown in Elizabeth's reign as these people return and as England attempts to unify all these different fragmented religious communities. It's also ironic that the daughter of the king obsessed with having a son should prove to be one of the greatest rulers that England ever had. It's under her rule that England defeats the mighty Spanish Armada that had attempted to invade and builds a naval power that opens the door to England's colonial expansion and the start of the British Empire, on which the sun would never set for a certain period in time. If only Henry VIII had known that daughters could rule as well as sons, history might have been very different. This brings me to the end, finally, of the series on Henry VIII and the Church of England. There are 5 episodes, so if you enjoyed this one but didn't catch the previous ones, you can go ahead and fill in some of the gaps in your understanding of this period. If you enjoyed this series, you might enjoy some of the other series on the podcast, including The Great Schism, about how the Christian world divided into Catholic and Orthodox, or perhaps the episode on what happened when English Puritans reached the New World to spread religious freedom and witch burning. You can find that under the Salem Witch Trials series. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the future episodes, and consider sharing it with someone else who you think would also appreciate them. You can find all these episodes on Spotify, anywhere you stream audio, or in the illustrated version on YouTube.